The Secret Code of the Royal Guard. How Silence Stopped a Crisis. Welcome to our channel. In today's gripping story, we take you behind the gates of Clarence House, where an unexpected silent signal from a royal guard could have prevented a disaster. As the world watched, one small, almost imperceptible gesture set in motion a chain of events that would go unnoticed by many, but not by those who were trained to read between the lines. Curious to know what happens next? Drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more extraordinary stories like this one, coming your way tomorrow. The grand halls of Clarence House were filled with anticipation as the royal ceremony began. The air was thick with tension, every eye fixed on the high-profile guests and dignitaries. This was no ordinary event. It was a meticulously planned, high-stakes occasion, meant to showcase the strength of the royal family's traditions and global influence. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated, from the seating arrangements to the lavish decor, ensuring that everything unfolded perfectly in front of an international audience. As the dignitaries took their seats and the ceremony commenced, the atmosphere grew even more intense. The presence of foreign delegates added to the pressure, their expectant gazes causing the air to hum with the weight of importance. Yet within the formal surroundings of the Grand Hall, one element remained. Unspoken yet critical, the royal guards. These silent sentinels stood at attention, their immovable stance symbolizing the unyielding discipline of the British monarchy. To the public, they were part of the spectacle, figures of honor and tradition. To those behind the scenes, however, they were the silent guardians of a much larger purpose. Among the ranks of guards was Sergeant Callum, a seasoned royal guard, whose years of service had seen countless ceremonies and events. He stood at his post with a calm, unwavering composure, his eyes scanning the room, each movement calculated, each breath in sync with the rhythm of the ceremony. It was a job that demanded perfection, no sudden movements, no gestures that could break the solemnity of the moment. For the guards, this was more than just a position. It was a symbol of their commitment to duty and their unwavering loyalty to the crown. As the ceremony unfolded before him, Callum's mind stayed sharp, his training guiding him through the motions. He could feel the weight of the world's attention on the ceremony, but it was the weight of internal expectations that kept his focus. The world outside had its eyes on Clarence House, but it was the unspoken signals, the subtle shifts in the environment, that mattered most in his line of work. He had learned long ago that the smallest change could signal danger, even if no one else noticed. A slight shift in the air, a subtle glance exchanged between colleagues, could mean something more than what was visible to the untrained eye. Despite the flurry of activity around him, Callum knew that his duty wasn't to the spectacle unfolding in front of him. His duty was to remain a steadfast, silent presence, watching for the smallest hint of trouble. It wasn't uncommon for threats to be hidden in plain sight, beneath the surface of perfectly orchestrated ceremonies. As a guard, he was trained to notice things that others wouldn't. Small discrepancies, unnoticed movements, even the flicker of a glance from his comrades that might indicate something was amiss. And in this moment, standing at his post, Callum could sense that something wasn't quite right. It was a feeling that wasn't easily explained, something just outside the line of his vision, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was so subtle, in fact, that no one else seemed to notice it. But Callum had been trained for years to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that something was off. The pressure in the room built slowly, creeping into his thoughts as he processed the subtle details of his surroundings. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened, but outwardly he remained unmoved, his stance rigid and unwavering. This was the discipline he had sworn to uphold, a discipline so precise that it allowed him to remain vigilant even when everything around him seemed perfectly calm. But in that moment, Callum couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by the dignitaries but by something else, something unseen. As the ceremony continued, he remained at his post, a silent sentinel amidst the grandeur, waiting, watching and listening for any sign that the invisible threat might reveal itself. It was a moment of unspoken tension, one that few would ever know had existed. But for Callum, it was just another day in a life lived under the intense scrutiny of tradition and duty. Little did anyone know, the next few moments would hinge on his ability to stay silent, focused, and above all, alert. As the ceremony continued with military precision, Callum Hayes remained rooted in his position, an immovable figure amidst the orchestrated grandeur. His mind, though trained to remain calm, couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at him. The crowd's quiet chatter, the delicate clink of glassware, the soft shuffle of feet, all seemed normal, but there was something in the air that wasn't. Something felt off. It wasn't until he noticed a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye that his attention sharpened even further. At the far end of the formation, one of the younger guards seemed to be shifting uneasily. Nothing obvious at first, just a slight lowering of his posture, as if trying to adjust without drawing attention. Callum's eyes narrowed. In a room, full of perfectly poised soldiers, this subtle deviation from the usual rigid discipline stood out like a sore thumb. He'd seen it before in the eyes of the newer recruits. Nervousness, hesitation, fear. But this was different. The guard's gaze darted from one side of the room to the other, as if searching for something. His stance, too, wasn't quite right, slightly hunched, more as if he were trying to hide than stand proud. A typical rookie mistake? Perhaps. But Callum knew that in moments like these, nothing could be left to chance. There was a brief flicker of eye contact between them. For a fraction of a second, the young guard's eyes met Callum's. And that's when it hit him. It wasn't just nervousness or a lapse in posture. It was a silent plea, a desperate cry for help. The slight dip of the guard's head, the barely noticeable shift of his weight, all of it added up to something Callum had learned to recognize over his years of service. There was danger in that look. Callum had been trained not to react. It was one of the first rules drummed into every Royal Guard's mind. Never show any emotion, never break formation, never speak. Silence was your shield, discipline your weapon. But here, in this moment, discipline felt like a weight too heavy to bear. His instincts screamed at him that something was terribly wrong. The young guard wasn't just fidgeting. He was trying to signal something, and it was up to Callum to decode it. Slowly, carefully, Callum began to inch his boot forward, the tip of his shoe lightly scraping the surface of the polished stone floor. 3 sharp taps, spaced evenly apart. It was a signal he'd been trained to use, a nonverbal warning. 3 taps meant danger, something was out of place, and the rest of the guards needed to stay alert. It was a subtle motion, barely noticeable, but for anyone who knew what to look for, it spoke volumes. The ground beneath them hummed with tension, as the distant sound of the tap echoed faintly in the otherwise quiet room. Callum felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as his foot remained still, his boot lightly grazing the floor. Every part of his training was telling him not to move, not to give away any hint of the unease he felt stirring in his gut. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, and that the young guard, standing just a few feet away, was somehow involved. Seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as the room continued on as if nothing was amiss. The ceremonial speeches droned on, the media cameras flashed, but Callum couldn't stop watching. He kept his focus fixed on the young guard, whose gaze had shifted toward the rear of the room. His eyes were wide now, locked on something or someone in the distance, signaling even more urgently without ever moving a muscle. It was at that precise moment that Callum caught a glimpse of something shiny at the young guard's waist. A glint of metal that didn't belong, a small, unusual object, half concealed in the folds of his uniform. The hair on Callum's neck stood even taller now. What was it? And why was the guard trying so desperately to keep it hidden? Callum's mind raced. This was no rookie mistake. This was something far more serious and dangerous. But the rules were clear. No speaking, no moving out of formation. Yet as the young guard continued to shift, barely perceptible, Callum knew he had to act quickly. The subtle, imperceptible movements were more than just discomfort. They were an indication of a threat, one that no one in the room had noticed yet. But Callum had seen enough to understand that silence, in this case, was not enough. The tension in the room escalated with every passing second. Callum's heart beat steadily in his chest, but his mind was a whirlwind of calculation and instinct. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, knowing that everything hung on a single imperceptible signal. He was a seasoned guard, and this was his job: to observe, to listen, and to react before anyone else even noticed that something was wrong. But this was different. This was beyond what his training had prepared him for. The young guard shifted. Once more, his body language screaming of something amiss, but still, no one else had noticed. The world around them moved at a slow, deliberate pace. The dignitaries smiled, the cameras flashed, and the ceremony proceeded without a hint of disruption. But Callum's senses were sharpened to a razor's edge. The young guard's subtle fidgeting was no longer just nervousness. It was a calculated attempt to communicate something dire. Callum glanced down at his boots, carefully shifting his foot again, the soft scrape of the polished leather against the floor cutting through the heavy silence. 3 taps, short, sharp, and even. It was the signal, the warning, and as the sound reverberated slightly in the stillness of the hall, he hoped it wasn't too late. The young guard's eyes flickered, and for just a moment, Callum saw him nod ever so slightly. It was almost imperceptible, a movement so slight that if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it. But Callum wasn't about to miss it. The signal had been received. The warning had been understood. His next move was crucial. Callum knew he couldn't break formation, not yet, but he had to act, and he had to do it now, before things spiraled out of control. The rule was simple: no talking, no gestures, no deviation from position. But Callum had been trained for moments like this. He had been trained for moments when the unspoken code was more important than any order on paper. He shifted his gaze to the rest of the team, carefully scanning each of them. His eyes locked on one of the other guards, a veteran like him, someone who would know what to do if the moment arose. Without breaking eye contact, Callum subtly tilted his head, just a fraction of an inch. It was a silent command, a silent recognition that the danger was real, and that action was required. At that moment, the sound of the taps echoed in the quiet room again, and for the first time, Callum felt a shift. The atmosphere in the room, once tense but calm, now carried an edge, a sense that something was about to happen. The guards, all of them, were attuned to the rhythm of the ceremony, and yet, for the first time, they weren't just standing. Still, they were listening, watching, ready. Callum felt his pulse quicken as he shifted his attention back to the young guard. The tension was palpable now, thick in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The guard had returned to his position, his posture just a little too stiff, too perfect. But Callum's trained eyes could see it. He could see the unease, the fear still radiating from the younger man, and that, more than anything, told him all he needed to know. The subtle movement of the young guard's hand was the last clue he needed. It was small, barely a shift, but it was enough to reveal what Callum had suspected all along. The guard wasn't just trying to signal. He was trying to hide something, something dangerous. Callum's mind raced as he mentally calculated his next steps. The object in the guard's possession was still unknown, but the way the guard had reacted told Callum one thing. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a simple error in judgment. This was something far more calculated. Someone had planned this, and now Callum had to act fast. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs as his eyes flicked to the other guards around him. The weight of the decision settled on his shoulders, but there was no time for hesitation. The danger was real, and it was closing in faster than anyone had realized. He had to trust in the signals, trust in the training that had prepared him. For moments just like this, he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Something was about to happen. The young guard's eyes met his once again, a look of desperation flashing across his face. And Callum knew without a doubt that they were in the middle of something bigger than they had been prepared for. The question was, what would happen next? The ceremony continued around them, the atmosphere thick with protocol, yet everything seemed to be moving in slow motion for Callum. He stood still, eyes locked on the young guard, who now appeared to be more agitated than ever. Every shift of the guard's body, every tiny glance, every micro-movement screamed of a deeper issue. Callum had seen many things in his years of service, but this moment felt different. The danger wasn't just present, it was looming. And it was clear now that the young guard was trying to communicate something far more urgent than Callum had first suspected. The ceremony was nearing its climax. The dignitaries exchanged pleasantries, the cameras flashed, and yet, in this sea of formalities, a silent danger was brewing just beneath the surface. The air felt heavy now, suffused with an electric charge. Callum's training had taught him to never break composure, never show any sign of emotion. But today, the lines between discipline and instinct were blurring. The guard's desperate signals, though subtle, were growing more and more difficult to ignore. Then, as if on cue, the young guard's hand shifted again. This time not subtly but with purpose. He reached for something hidden beneath his tunic, and Callum's eyes narrowed instinctively. There, tucked into the fabric, was the glint of metal, an unfamiliar shape that sent a chill down his spine. For a moment, Callum's heart skipped. A beat. What was it? What had the young guard been hiding all this time? In that instant, everything clicked into place. The young guard hadn't been fidgeting out of nervousness. He hadn't been adjusting his position out of simple discomfort. He was hiding something, something he didn't want anyone else to see. And it wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was deliberate. The guard had something on him, something that could compromise everything they were there to protect. Callum's mind raced as his thoughts whirred through the possible scenarios. What was the object? A weapon, a device, something far more sinister? The whispers of danger that had been growing in the back of his mind suddenly became a deafening roar. There was no time left to hesitate. His next move had to be swift and decisive, or they'd risk a disaster that could unfold right before their eyes. Callum's pulse quickened. The young guard's actions had crossed a line. But what could Callum do? They were trapped in the rules of silence, trapped in their roles as protectors of the ceremony. He couldn't speak, couldn't break formation, but he knew that something had to be done. It was a delicate balance. A single misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. His eyes darted to the other guards, searching for any sign that they'd noticed the same thing. He couldn't afford to act alone. He needed to communicate, needed to send a signal to the others that something was wrong. But how? The rules of engagement were clear. No communication unless absolutely necessary. But this was beyond necessity. This was a matter of life and death. Callum's mind went into overdrive. He couldn't speak, but he could use his training to send a message. His foot shifted again, this time more deliberately. 3 taps, sharp, fast, urgent. The signal was clear. The others would know what it meant. He had to trust them now. Trust that they would recognize the warning. Trust that they would move before it was too late. A few tense seconds passed, and then, as if on cue, Callum saw the slight change in the guard's posture. Their bodies stiffened ever so slightly, their eyes scanning the room with newfound vigilance. They had seen it. They had understood. They were ready. And now, it was a race against time. As Callum focused back on the young guard, he saw the telltale signs of nervousness flicker in the man's eyes. The young guard's hand twitched toward his side again, but this time he hesitated. The glint of metal was clear now, unmistakable in the dim light. It was a small rectangular object, something that looked like a tracker, a device that had no business being in the hands of a royal guard. The weight of the revelation hit Callum like a punch to the gut. This was not just a personal mistake. It was a breach of security. The realization settled in, cold and terrifying. The young guard wasn't just trying to conceal the device. He was trying to cover up a warning that could have saved them all. But why? What had happened to the man to put him in such a position? Had he been coerced? Forced? Or was there something more to this story than Callum could have imagined? The young guard looked back at Callum, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He knew he had been caught. He knew there was no way to escape the truth now. But Callum couldn't ask him. He couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything except wait for the next move, the next signal, and hope they could act fast, enough to prevent a tragedy from unfolding. The room seemed to hold its breath as the young guard's eyes flickered nervously. Callum stood there, frozen in place, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. His heart hammered in his chest, and yet, outwardly, he remained still, a silent sentinel in the midst of the chaos unfolding around him. Everything was happening so fast, and yet in some strange way it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. As the ceremony drew to its final moments, Callum could feel the tension rising in the air. The young guard, still attempting to hide the metal device against his side, seemed to sense that the game was up. His eyes darted nervously, glancing at Callum for just a split second before quickly shifting his gaze back to the ground. He knew deep down that he had been caught. There was no way out now, but Callum couldn't move. He couldn't break his position, couldn't reach out to help the guard, not without risking everything. There was a fine line between action and chaos in moments like these, and Callum had been trained for this. He had to rely on his fellow guards to understand the silent signal he'd given. 3 taps of the foot, sharp and unmistakable. It was the universal call to arms, a warning that something had gone terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the young guard straightened up abruptly, his posture rigid as if trying to appear calm. But Callum could see the fear in his eyes. The weight of the device tucked so carefully against his uniform seemed to bear down on him. He was trapped, and Callum could feel it. The question was, what had he discovered? Was the device a threat? A tracking device, a bomb, or something even worse? Callum's mind raced. This was no longer just a routine ceremony. It had become something far darker. The young guard's actions weren't just signs of nervousness. They were signs of a man caught in something much bigger than he could handle. And now, Callum had to decide how to act. As if on cue, a faint signal from the other guards told him. They had received his warning. Their posture shifted ever so slightly, an imperceptible movement, but one that carried the full weight of their readiness. They were watching. They knew. The response had been set in motion, and now Callum was just a player in the unfolding drama. But as the final moments of the ceremony approached, Callum felt the cold reality of the situation sink in. They were running out of time. He had to make sure that the young guard's secret didn't destroy everything they had worked so hard to protect. The eyes of the world were on them, and a single misstep would send everything spiraling into chaos. The young guard's eyes, filled with a mixture of panic and resignation, met Callum's once more. The weight of his failure, his fear, was written across his face. For a fleeting moment, Callum saw a glimpse of the man behind the uniform, a person who had been trapped in circumstances beyond his control. But there was no time for pity. No time for second chances. Callum's mind raced as he made the decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act, and he had to act now. The young guard had failed, and now it was up to Callum to keep the disaster from escalating further. The ceremony had ended, but the real mission was just beginning. As the dignitaries slowly filed out of the room, Callum knew that the true danger hadn't passed. The young guard had been a pawn in something much larger, and now it was Callum's job to prevent whatever that something was from being unleashed. In a blur of motion, Callum turned his gaze to the rest of the guards. They understood. Their actions were swift, deliberate. The young guard was quickly surrounded, but there was no violent confrontation, no shouts or alarms. Just cold, efficient action, just the way it had been drilled into them over and over again. And then, in the quiet that followed, Callum heard the sound he had been dreading, the unmistakable crack of a voice breaking the silence. "You've done well, Sergeant." It was the voice of his captain, but there was no praise in it, no congratulatory tone. Just the cold, hard acknowledgement of what had just transpired. "You caught it," the captain continued. "But now you've got to deal with it." Callum nodded silently. There would be no celebration, no congratulations. Just the silent knowledge that in this line of work, the price of doing what was right often came with an invisible cost. The room had emptied, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any words spoken. Callum stood motionless, his body still at attention, but his mind was racing. The young guard had been escorted away, discreetly, without any fanfare, but the weight of the situation lingered in the air like a dark cloud. The dignitaries had left, unaware of the close call that had nearly shattered the delicate fabric of their carefully orchestrated world. But for Callum, the real story had only just begun. As the last of the guests departed, Callum was left standing, alone, his eyes focused on the polished stone floor beneath his boots. The subtle scrape of his foot against the ground earlier had set everything in motion. He hadn't known exactly what he would find, but now that the danger had been neutralized, the questions were piling up in his mind. What was the young guard carrying? What had he found? And why had he been so desperate to hide it? Callum's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The captain's presence was as commanding as ever, and Callum could feel the weight of the conversation coming. He straightened his posture, ready to face whatever came next. The captain's voice broke the silence, cold and measured. "You did well, Sergeant," the captain said. But it wasn't without a cost. Callum's heart skipped a beat. The words weren't a compliment. They were an acknowledgement of the risks they had just barely avoided. He nodded, keeping his voice neutral, his face a mask of professionalism. "I did what I had to, sir," Callum replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He wasn't sure if he was convincing himself or the captain. The captain paused for a moment, then continued, his tone still low but laced with something deeper, something heavier. "Your silence saved us today, but it also cost us. The young guard is gone. He'll never wear that uniform again, and the rest of us will never forget the price he paid. But what we won't forget even more is the lesson. Not all threats are visible." Callum felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the captain was right. They'd been lucky. But what if they hadn't been? What if Callum hadn't caught that? Small, subtle signal, the slight hesitation in the young guard's eyes, the faint but deliberate movement of his boot. What if he hadn't tapped his foot 3 times, sending the warning that had led to their swift action? The captain's words hung in the air like a fog, settling over Callum's thoughts. "You did more than your duty today, Sergeant. You acted when others would have frozen. That's why you're still here. That's why you were trained." Callum's mind flashed back to the ceremony, the strict discipline, the unspoken rules. He had followed those rules his entire life. He'd learned to be still, to remain silent, to never break formation. But today, those rules had been tested. They had almost failed. And if it hadn't been for that one crucial moment, when Callum had trusted his instincts, everything could have gone terribly wrong. "I didn't do it alone," Callum replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The others, they understood," the captain interrupted. "They knew, and that's why they followed your lead. But remember this, silence is not always enough. Sometimes the quietest signals are the loudest, and sometimes the consequences are hidden in plain sight." Callum nodded, his mind absorbing the captain's words. He knew this wasn't just about the young guard, about the object he had hidden, or the threat that had been neutralized. It was about the unspoken rule they all followed, the duty to protect, to serve, to act without hesitation when it mattered most. It wasn't just about the visible danger. It was about recognizing the invisible, the threats that lurked beneath the surface, the ones that couldn't be seen but were always there. The captain's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "You did what had to be done. Now, the rest of us will carry on." But never forget that the true cost of duty is never as simple as what we can see. As Callum stood there, silently processing the weight of the conversation, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The young guard's fate was sealed, but the lesson would stay with Callum forever. In their world, silence wasn't just a rule, it was a weapon, and today it had saved them all. But in the back of his mind, Callum couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger wasn't over yet. The threat had been averted for now, but he knew that there would always be something else lurking, something just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, he would be ready. Because in this line of duty, there was no room for hesitation. Thank you for watching this intense story unfold. We've just witnessed the incredible discipline, sacrifice, and the silent, unseen moments that define a royal guard's duty. But here's where we want to hear from you. What did you think about the young guard's actions? Was he just following orders, or was there something deeper going on? Could you have made the same decision as Callum, or would you have reacted differently? Let's talk about the tension in the room, the unspeakable signals, the pressure of following strict rules, and how small, seemingly insignificant gestures can mean everything. In such high-stakes situations, how important is it to trust your instincts over following protocol? Do you think Callum's decision to stay silent and act quickly was the right one? Or do you think there could have been another way to handle the situation? Your thoughts and perspectives mean so much to us. Share your opinion in the comments below, and feel free to start a conversation with fellow viewers. Do you have a story where you had to rely on your instincts? We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more gripping stories. Thank you for being part of our journey.